Welcome back to a Slice of Empathy podcast, where we explore stories of resilience, growth, and the power of the human spirit. And today I'm thrilled to announce Jessica, who is a life coach, a mental health advocate, and a motivational speaker who is on a mission to inspire and empower others. Currently, she is gearing up to release her first documentary, which is called Cracked. It is a raw and vulnerable exploration of her journey towards love and acceptance after experiencing trauma related to her father's schizophrenia. And through her work, she's breaking stigmas that surround mental health, encouraging others to live their best lives despite life's challenges. Her story and insights are truly inspiring, and I couldn't be more excited to have her join us today. So let's dive into this impactful conversation. Well, I really appreciate your flexibility and joining me today. I'm excited to learn more about you and about your background. So if you could start off by telling us a little bit about you, and then we'll go from there.
So it's nice to meet you, Valerie. A little bit about my background is I am a transformational life coach, and my whole metaphor for coaching is helping people remember that they are the pearl. So many of us have grit in our lives, and we often confuse ourselves with being the grit. And it's really the grit, the things that happen in our lives that actually make us so beautiful and precious and unique. And so it's really reminding people they are the pearl and not the grit. And we also have shells around our pearl that we close in times of fear, which is natural and appropriate at times. And the key is if we're in the shell too long, life starts to be lonely, dark, isolating, constricting, and you need to shuck it open with love. Love is the only thing that helps us open our shells and let the pearl inside shine. So that's my metaphor. And really, I just try to help people break through their fears so they can live their best life.
Oh, I love that analogy. It's such a beautiful way of looking at it. And I think for so many of us, we hear like we put a shell around ourselves or build up walls around ourselves. And I love how you mentioned that, like being the pearl in the center of all that. That's just so beautiful. I want to kind of talk a little bit about your home life growing up. You mentioned having a parent who had schizophrenia. How did these early experiences shape and resilience over the years?
Yeah, my father, he is the one that was experiencing schizophrenia, and the way it manifested for him, this is not true for all people that are experiencing schizophrenia, but for him, there were often bouts of violence and rage, and really created an unstable environment for me in my younger years. And then my mom broke us free, and so she was able to give me a more solid foundation for healing and growth. And what that did with my relationship with my father is we were separated for about 25 years. And most of that was because I didn't feel strong enough or healthy enough to have a relationship with him, with the unpredictability and some of his behaviors. And through my own healing journey, I finally felt strong enough to reconnect with him. And when we did, it was just such a beautiful blessing to really see him through a different lens and experience him in the best way possible. It definitely required boundaries because his behavior was still unpredictable and potentially dangerous, but it was workable, right? I would just have to meet him in public or with other people with me. And I'm just so grateful that I did get to reconnect with him.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you did a lot of healing during that time. Would you say that it was a time of maybe reflection or healing from your father? Did you feel like he was the same person all those years later?
There was a ton of healing, and I think we both changed a lot in those years. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly all the ways he changed just because my memory of him from 7 years old to my 30s was not entirely clear or complete. And so it was almost like I met a new person when we did reconnect. And I think that benefited both of us because originally when I reconnected with him, I saw him through the lens of crazy and I labeled everything he said and did as crazy. And that was on me. And I needed to see beyond that lens, beyond that filter to really see the true him. And when I got to see his soul and just what a magnificent person he was. And so that's what I hope for everybody is that we can see beyond labels or boxes that we try to put people in to really see the whole person, all parts, all the good, the bad, all the human stuff. And yeah, just love each other for all those pieces.
Such a beautiful way you said that. And I think for so many of us, and like, especially those maybe coming from abuse, a lot of us are hyper focused on the negative aspects, even though there may have been some parts where there were positive. We're so focused on the negative. And that tends to be for so many people throughout for many things. We have that, the glass half full, right? A lot of times we're focusing on those negative things and we kind of lose sight of those things, those beautiful, those positive things that are happening. And it can be really challenging. I want to acknowledge it for so many people, especially coming from abuse. It could be difficult, of course, depending on the situation that someone might be going through. But I think that's just such a beautiful way of looking at it. And especially 25 years, that's a long time. And for most people, I want to say, like, we've changed in some way, shape, or form. It's a long time to go without any sort of change at all. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And you have a documentary. Did you want to share that with us?
I do. It just came out. It's called Cracked, and it's a 20-minute film about my father and my journey and really about finding the love and acceptance of him. And my hope is that it shows people that there's other possibilities. I really didn't know what healing was or that things could be different. I just thought this is how life was. And I often felt like a victim of circumstances. And it was when I started to make the shifts and do the healing that I really saw that I had a choice. I didn't have a choice of who my father was or the situation I went through, but I had a choice of how to look at it and how to relate to it. And it doesn't excuse his behavior in any way. More what that did for me, Valerie, was allow me to let go of that burden, to let go of that weight, because I hadn't done anything wrong. And that's the liberation I want everyone to feel. And even if we've done things in our life that we do regret, we can take responsibility, apologize, and try to make amends. And that's also a beautiful path. But so often we are reliving things that we don't need to and allowing that to hold us back from our lives. And I know that there's freedom on the other side. And so that's why I wanted to put this film into the world and share our story just in case it might reach somebody that could use a little hope and healing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you often hear the saying that forgiveness is really for ourselves and not necessarily for the other person, and mostly like for us to be able to heal and move on. Would you say that's accurate?
100%. I definitely think the forgiveness I came to with my father was the best gift I could have given myself. I do think it helped him though too, because it took the pressure off the relationship. And I know inside of him, he felt regret and shame and a variety of things too. I mean, he didn't get to that place without experiencing his own trauma. And I really have a lot of compassion for him. Again, compassion is different than tolerance or condoning his behavior, but thinking about how he might have come to that place also really helped me forgiving him and what happened. So, but you're absolutely right. The forgiveness has lightened my load, and I don't need to carry that around anymore. And I don't want anybody to carry around situations like that.
Yeah, it's definitely liberating for sure. And sometimes it takes time for sure to get to that point. But when you do and just realizing it's for me, like I want to feel free and feel good and not be weighed down by the resentment or anger, or frustration, whatever it may be. So I really appreciate that you mentioned that. And I want to pivot just a little bit. You mentioned caring for a loved one who had stage 4 cancer, something that my husband and I definitely can relate to. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, fortunately he survived, and my heart just breaks for anyone who has walked a journey like that, and especially those that have lost people to cancer or other tragic things. What it was for me, though, it just was a really profound experience to leaning into faith, and it allowed us to grow really close because this particular person, it was really a scary situation and one that there was possibility of them dying. And to have those kind of honest and raw conversations with somebody is truly a privilege. It was so beautiful and so hard and totally drained me because I wanted to be the best caregiver possible. And that's just being the caregiver, let alone what they were going through. I do just think it was such a blessing to witness their strength and to support them on such an important part of their life. And also it's just so interesting too, all the choices that are available and helping him navigate what choices are right for him, because there's no way I could have made the choices. But yet then there was times that he was so weak and on so many drugs that his mind wasn't totally there. So there's this delicate balance and dance that we walked in this journey, and really so many blessings, but also one of the hardest things to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can totally relate because, well, in my case, it was my mother-in-law, and my husband and I were fairly newly married, also pretty young and going to college at this point in time. And I remember it was difficult. And my husband particularly has lost both his parents to brain cancer. And so having to navigate that, he was under 30 by the time both of his parents had passed, different times. His dad passed before I met my husband. But I think it is difficult, especially you're married or if it's a close relative. It really, I don't want to say put a strain on your relationship, but things can be really difficult and it could be hard to navigate. And there's like a lot of things that I didn't realize. I was probably in my early 20s at this point, but looking back, how long has it been now? 11, 12 years later, I know my husband was thankful for being there and for the support, because I feel like he had very limited support from the rest of his family. But yeah, so I think it's a really difficult thing to go through, especially as a caregiver, and for anyone who might be listening and going through that, I totally commend you for the resilience in that. It's a hard thing to have to watch someone you love go through that. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about your travel experiences. I know you had a traumatic brain injury. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, first, let me just acknowledge you and your husband for your journey and the love you poured into him through that time. And for anybody listening too, if you don't know what to do, don't worry. Just like a phone call, a card, bring a meal over. It could be anything. Just go spend time with them. Maybe give the caregiver a break a little bit. So there's so many ways to help. If you don't know of any ideas, I can definitely give you some. Often the person in the midst of it doesn't know what to ask for. So just do something. And then for those of you that are in that process, like ask for help too. Even though you don't know what you need, just ask. And people want to help. They just don't know how. So that's what I would add to everything you just said. And yes, I was hiking in Nepal and ended up getting helicoptered off the mountain. And it was kind of a wild experience. I was with it, but I wasn't. And it was so interesting because my body was starting to shut down. It was freezing on the mountain and I was so hot and just trying to rip off all the layers of warmth I had. And thank God for my guides. They saved my life and they got me down to safety. So what happened was we hit about 15,000 feet and my body just couldn't handle it. And so it was in the middle of the night and we were not going to get a helicopter until the morning. And so what they did is they took me down to the village at a lower elevation. And so there we are, I had two guides helping me down the mountain in the middle of the night. And thank God there was a full moon. So we had a lot of light helping us, but it was wild. And then to be in a foreign country in the ER where nobody spoke English and I definitely didn't speak their language and trying to understand what was happening to me. So I'm just grateful for all the care. One of my favorite stories though is I actually ended up breaking out of the hospital and I told the front desk that, hey, if I owed more money because there I had to prepay or whatever, that this is the hospital or the hotel I was going to be checked into for a little while. Why I broke myself out of the hospital is exactly why I needed to be there because I didn't have any brain functioning in the right way that it should have been. But here we are. And I went to the hotel and because I had been hiking about 11 or 12 days in the mountains with, different food and not a ton of protein, I went to the buffet and I ate 11 plates of food and the whole staff was standing around my table, wondering what was going on with this petite woman that was eating like a linebacker on a football team. But then the other part was the hospital actually called me at the hotel and stopped by to give me a refund because I broke out. I overpaid. They said they actually owed me money. And I was like, what? A hospital actually giving me money back? What's up with that? So what a kind culture the Nepalese are. And I'm just so grateful that I got down safely. And then I came back to the US and got great care here. But yeah, it was a wild, wild story. And it took months, probably about 6 months before I could really form sentences again. And sitting in that time, I was really worried that it was going to be like that forever. And that's just another experience too, to really think about all the things we take for granted and how lucky we are that if our bodies are working, our brains are working, and just a good reminder to find that gratitude.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you shared an experience with us. I can't even imagine. That sounds terrifying. But even then, you are able to put a positive spin on that, as you said, with the Nepalese people. And as someone, I love to travel myself and experience a variety of cultures. And that's just amazing to hear that even though that happened, you're still able to kind of bring something out of that. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us. I actually want to touch on boundaries. That's one of my favorite subjects. It looks like this is one of your pearls of wisdom. And can you tell us about how you go about maybe working with clients to work on boundaries?
Oh, great topic that everybody should know about and understand and learn how to use in their life. And for me, it was really hard setting boundaries earlier in my life because I was so worried about disappointing people or conflict. And so I offer that to everybody to start with is you matter. And if you are going to upset people with your boundaries, instead of worrying about losing them, look at it potentially as a filter for getting rid of some of the people that don't belong in your space, that don't respect your space and your time and your energy in the way that you want to. And I know that's a big leap for some people. It was for me, at least, to come to this place of understanding that I needed to show people how to treat me. Really. It's like, that's to me what boundaries are. It's like, here are the things I really want in our relationship. And whatever that might be for each person. I will say, Valerie, when I first started to learn about boundaries, I didn't know what boundaries to set. And so I went through and got examples of other people's boundaries. And so I have a worksheet that has examples of boundaries for people to really start learning it. Like, what does a boundary look like and which ones might I want? And then the thing that you can do is really pay attention to when you get upset. And that's typically a sign that somebody's crossed a boundary that you might have not realized that you actually had. So if, somebody's late to dinner or whatever it might be, and that's really upsetting to you, that's a boundary. That shows that you want people to respect your time in the same way that you're respecting theirs. Or maybe somebody breaks a boundary going too private in a conversation. And if it feels uncomfortable, that's your signal that there's probably an opportunity to establish a boundary there and say something to the effect of, hey, I don't feel comfortable talking about that, but let's talk about something else. And so there's so many places we can set boundaries. It's with maybe our energy, our time, how deep we want to go in conversations. We can set boundaries with ourselves for social media, or how much time we're willing to donate to our community. Like, there's so many beautiful ways to create structures in our life that support us in being healthier and really bring inner peace to us. Because if we're living a life that we're designing through boundaries, our relationships are going to be healthier. Our conversations are going to be more aligned with us. Our decisions are going to be more aligned with what's right for us. So we could talk about boundaries for a long time, but that's at least a little window into boundaries. But any questions or things you want to add, Valerie?
Yeah, honestly, I always welcome long conversations about boundaries, but I do want to touch on like boundaries for ourselves, because that is something that I have recently been trying to implement. And we talk so much about, having boundaries with other people, family, friends, spouses, whatever it is, but we don't really talk too much, I feel like, about having boundaries with ourselves. And I like that you touched on that, because something that I actually have been trying to do pretty recently, actually, is turning off notifications on my phone that aren't essential. This is generally like social media, work emails, when I'm not working, things like that. And I've noticed kind of a mental shift. So I'm not feeling all flustered and anxious. I'm having a million notifications on my phone. And it's funny because like I've had people comment, they're like, oh my gosh, you have so many notifications. Like, how do you do that? And honestly, they were right. It was really life-changing for me to not have to feel like I have to like check my phone all the time, again, for things that aren't essentials. So it was really something that I kind of had to kind of come to terms with. And another thing that comes to mind for me is like people even have boundaries with themselves as far as finances. And so for me, that's also something that, again, that I've been trying to work on too, whether it's like, having a limit that maybe you set for yourself when you go shopping. I like to go thrifting. So I've been trying to be better at, hey, this is my limit, or maybe I'm only going to use a gift card for this, and anything beyond, I'm not going to get, I can't afford it. And so it's definitely a work in progress. It's something that I'm realizing that is just so important to have for ourselves. They're just as important as anything that you have for other folks. And I also, as far as having boundaries when it comes to maybe other people, another thing that I hear is that boundaries are for us and not necessarily the other person. When I say that, my understanding of that is that you have a boundary and that person, say they continue to cross it. There has to be some sort of action on your part that you're going to do rather than this is my boundary. You can't cross it because we can't control other people. We can only really control ourselves. And so it's really going to be a burden on our part to basically do something about it if that person continues to cross it.
Well said. We have to enforce our boundaries if we want people to respect them. And it's not always easy because also the people that you need to reinforce it with are probably the ones that aren't as willing to abide by your boundaries too, right? If they need enforcement, that's either one, they didn't know, so then we educate, but two, if they just keep repeating that same thing, then it's really up to us to defend ourselves and to stand up for ourselves. And we can do it in loving and kind ways, and or you don't have to either. Like there's no rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually want to go back a little bit to when we talked about your father who has schizophrenia. I actually have similar scenario that I've encountered in my life as well. And that's with my aunt actually. And she's had bipolar manic depression with psychotic episodes. And previously, I think at some point it was bipolar with schizophrenia or something like that. And for a long time, I probably want to say at least 15 to 20 years, my aunt and I didn't really get along. And I think a lot of that is from like when I was a child. I think my mom, particularly because it's my mom's sister, would try to help me understand. I mean, there's only so much that children can really understand when it comes to mental illness. And I remember when I was younger, came from an abusive home as well, and trying to grapple with the fact that this relative would do or say certain things that would make me feel hurt or make me upset and not really understanding why. And so I think for me as a child, I was like, oh my gosh, it kind of reinforced these opinions that I had of myself. I'm not loved. I'm not cared for, yada, 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 and confidence and so on and so forth. And there are periods of time where I think there was one specific scenario where my aunt had thought I had stolen her yearbooks out of storage. I don't know where it came from. Unfortunately, there were a lot of family members that believed her that I did this. And it was just, I had to live with this for several years. And I think it was really only my mom that believed that I didn't do that. And eventually I think it was a couple of years later, 2, 3 years later, she ended up finding them. And I think it was something that it was hard for me to, especially so young, to have to live with. And fast forward so many years later, we just had a very kind of tenuous relationship. I didn't really want to go over to my grandmother's house because I didn't want to see her. There was a variety of different things. And she also had a son who was my cousin, and the way she navigated situations between me and him as children, some of the dynamics there really kind of made me feel like I wasn't really seen or heard. And I know, again, it was her son, but I felt like I was also a child, and I felt like my needs weren't really listened to. Long story short, so getting into like my teenage, early adulthood life, I just didn't really want to see her or really want to be around her. It was uncomfortable. And I think a lot of my family members can relate. As someone who has mental illness like that, we sometimes felt like we were walking on eggshells, really. And it wasn't until I think this was about 5 years ago where she had attempted suicide. And this wasn't the first time. Before I was born, my mom had mentioned this had been something she had done when she was much, much younger. And I was in my late 20s at this point when this had happened. And I think that in a way that had kind of brought us together because I went with my mom, my brother to see her while she was in a coma. And even though like we had this history, I felt like at that time I was able to let it go, to forget, to move forward, and everything considered, because I know that on some level, even as a child, I didn't realize this, but now as an adult, I realize that like these things weren't done intentionally to hurt me, even though at the time I felt like they were. So I think it took some
some level of self-awareness to kind of get to that point. And I remember when she came out of the coma, we had a long discussion, and it was just really powerful and liberating for both of us. Wow, so much richness in everything you just said. I just honor you for seeing your aunt in a new way and being there for her despite all the hardships you went through with her. So what a beautiful human you are, and she sounds amazing too. Thank you. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about corporate culture and what made you kind of jump ship. This is another favorite subject of mine. I love hearing people take risks to achieve their dreams. How did you overcome that fear or any self-doubt that you may have had in order to kind of make that jump? Yeah, there's so much to that beautiful question. It started with me shifting my perspective around money. When I was younger, I put a belief on money that it was somehow going to make me safe from something like I went through as a child. And I don't know where I adopted that idea, but it came with me into my adult years. And so it made me chase jobs that I thought could help me be more independent and have money to be safe. And so it started with unwinding that belief system. I started to realize that no matter how much money I had in the bank did not dictate whether or not I was safe. Those were very different things. And also, I just realized that I had quote unquote made it. And I was in my early 30s and I was working in international operations, and I had a dream of flying around the world. And I realized that I was flying to places that I wouldn't necessarily choose. And so I was always going to be living a life dictated by others. And if I was lucky, I was going to go to places I wanted to go. But if I was unlucky, I would be stuck in places I didn't want to be. And I was sacrificing so much. Like, I didn't have a pottery class, if you will, because I would be traveling around the world and doing things like that. And so the sacrifices just started to outweigh the risk of taking a chance on me. And so I did do it in a more subtle way, if you will. So I actually started my coaching practice while I still had my job. I was the only person supporting me financially. And so that felt like a healthier choice for me to prove that I was going to be a good coach and that this was a viable option for me. And so there were a lot of months, maybe even a year, where I didn't have a social life because I was doing my full-time job and building my coaching practice. And that was something I was willing to sacrifice, because if I could prove that this was a viable option, I could live a whole different life. And yeah, so I didn't have a social life while I was doing that. I was also getting my master's at the same time. And sometimes I think people feel like they need to jump across the Grand Canyon and take a massive leap like that. So what that might look like in this situation is that I just quit my job unknowingly and just pray something else works. And sometimes that's necessary, sometimes that's appropriate, but sometimes you can build it so that it's really a leap like the size of a sidewalk crack. And that's what I did, that felt more appropriate for me. And here I am. And now I get to do whatever I want every day, which my biggest challenge now is like choosing what of all the amazing options that I see that I actually want to do to serve the world. And that's a fun place to be. So if anybody out there is considering quitting your job, my encouragement is do it. If you're thinking about it, there's a reason, and it doesn't have to be today. You can put in some guardrails and build a bridge that feels a little safer to get to the other side, but take a step, get started, because just talking about it is not going to make anything happen. You actually have to take action too.
That's so true. And there couldn't be more emphasis on, we need to do something. And I think I was listening to a podcast pretty recently, and they're basically saying that a lot of times that we'll be perpetually stuck in, we have dreams or big dreams, right? And a lot of times we don't take action on them for whatever reasons. Could be a fear of maybe it doesn't work out the way that we wanted to do. We don't take action. So we're perpetually in the cycle where we're like, I want this, but we're not making any actionable steps. And I think this could be applied in so many different ways. And I'll be honest, I could be a big procrastinator. And for me, I think, and many of our listeners probably can relate to, if maybe something is holding us back from taking a big step, what about maybe breaking this down into bite-sized chunks? What are some little things that we can do day to day that will eventually, over a year, 2 years, 3 years, so on and so forth, bring us closer to that goal? So even if we have to break it down into little pieces and do it one step at a time, rather than looking at this big goal and we're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to get there. I don't think I can do it. This looks so overwhelming. And breaking it down, I think, for many of us who are chronic procrastinators, I think can really be beneficial or helpful. I want to learn more about your work as a coach, storyteller, and filmmaker. Can you tell us if there's anything you're currently working on? What's next for you that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, the big thing right now is Cracked, the documentary that I did with my dad. And so that is just consuming all my love and attention in trying to get that into the world. And I would love for everyone here to go out and watch it if you're so inspired. It's really just meant to be a love story and one for more hope and healing in our world. And then beyond that, I'm not sure what the world has in store for me. So right now it's just really doing my one-on-one coaching, and I do a lot of retreats and work with leadership teams and do speaking events and stuff like that. But as for a creative outlet, right now it's the documentary, and hopefully it's a tool to make a big impact in this world.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. And I just think, honestly, it's the perfect subject matter for our podcast. We're all about empathy, and I know our listeners will be so excited to learn more about what's next for you and what you're doing. Is there any, maybe say, a pearl of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners? One thing maybe that from our conversation that you'd like them to take away and maybe apply in their own lives?
Yes. The one that I would love is to look at people beyond the labels, beyond the diagnosis, beyond whatever title that they might have, and see the true person behind it. Because we miss so much when we put somebody inside of a box, and that includes yourself. So whatever way you might be labeling yourself or putting yourself in a box, free yourself and let yourself be who you are meant to be.
It's beautiful. And it's so true, because I think we live in a society where we are honestly quick to label people and honestly make predefined judgments against ourselves, against others, just based on a label. And really, it boils down to, we're just humans. We are people like everyone else. And, yes, we may learn differently or think differently, but we're all human beings. And for an example, like a lot of folks will be like, I have ADHD. And a lot of times they will let like labels define who they are as people. And yeah, I appreciate the label shouldn't define us. And we are more than just that. That's only a part of who we are. And before we hop off, can you tell us about maybe how listeners can connect with you, learn more about your programs, your documentary, or anything else that you might be pursuing?
Absolutely. My website is lifeshucker.com, LIFESHUCKER.com. And I'm Jessica Zemple. And as far as I know, I'm the only one out there in the world. So I'm easy to find on Instagram and YouTube and the Google. So yeah, Life Shucker and Jessica Zemple is the best way to find me.
Amazing. I'll make sure I get those down in our show notes as well when our episode gets published. But thank you so much for such a beautiful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to see what's next for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I so loved meeting you and hearing your wisdom too.
Oh, thank you. You as well.